The information and opinions presented in this podcast are based on research done at a particular point in time. The fields of medicine, surgery, psychology, etc. are constantly evolving as new studies and movements happen. Please take into account the year of any particular episode's publication, and as new information presents itself, we will do our best to release updated episodes on the topics. Listener discretion is advised for references to medical terminology of body parts. Unless otherwise stated, no one speaking on this podcast is a medical or legal professional and cannot provide medical or legal advice. Welcome to the Trans Field Guide. Welcome back on the show.
Good to be here.
Today we're going to start off with talking about detransitioning.
One of the things I was thinking about with the subject of detransition is just how to even define it. Because I know, I think way back with the first interview that we did, you asked, did I know anyone that has detransitioned? What were my thoughts on that, etc. And I had said, oh, you know what? Not really. And later on, I realized, you know what, actually, depending on the definition for detransition, I've known a handful of people that where I guess you could consider them to have detransitioned. And it's because I know I had a particular view of detransition. And I think some of that was built off of the more, I don't know, I guess kind of in-your-face articles that are out there and in social media of just saying, these people are detransitioning, and then it's the impression that this particular writer has of what detransitioning is, which is going to be the most shocking portrayal of that possible. That it's like, oh, someone has gone through all of these surgeries and then is absolutely crushed and devastated and depressed and trapped, etc. It's like, yes, that does happen, and there's going to be other experiences that are out there. Or maybe you have to call those other experiences something else. That's where I'm a fan of labels and refining labels, creating new labels, etc. So I don't know if detransition is going to capture all of those experiences, whether it's someone that really that wants to jump straight back to the sex and gender assigned at birth, versus my concept of it was more along the lines of just either continuing a transition in new directions, or otherwise just carrying on in your gender journey, perhaps as part of your own grander journey of identity and, I don't know, pursuit of your own authentic self.
That's a very solid and thoughtful concept on it, because it does bring about a very important question: is where do we draw the line between just gender exploration versus giving it the label of detransitioning? Usually, like what you've seen, a lot of what I've seen of where the word detransitioning has been used has been in somebody who has gotten to a certain extent of medical transition, mm-hmm. and has decided that this is not the path that is quite right for them for one reason or another, or that they cannot pursue this path due to social, familial obstacles or monetary obstacles or what have you, sometimes physiological obstacles, and have had to, for example, cease taking hormone replacement, potentially getting surgeries to quote-unquote reverse what they had surgically done. Big quotes there, because what do you consider to be reversing, and what that's a whole nother gray area in and of itself. Um, uh, and then either taking on what the gender identity that you were assigned at birth, or a new gender identity, usually something within the non-binary nebula. I'm not going to call it a spectrum anymore, because I've had it pointed out to me so many times that there are people that are just way far off of the spectrum on their own little planet. So it's a nebula now. Non-binary is a nebula. I have seen several people go from identifying as binary trans to later on identifying as some form of non-binary. And I've seen that for a couple of different reasons. I've seen that for physiological reasons, of that person's body just was not reacting in a positive way to the hormones, or the hormones were having a negative effect on them, on their brain chemistry, and so that was causing psychological issues, or that they just had a set of experiences happen that made them realize, hey, I have medically transitioned to this certain extent to the quote opposite binary gender. However, I still enjoy these things that fit more into my assigned binary gender. So therefore, I feel that it's more appropriate for me to identify as a non-binary identity. And I'm sure there's billions of more different examples of like reasoning that people will have for making these types of decisions. But then you also have people who haven't started any medical transitioning, but they've done social transitioning.
Mm-hmm.
Do we still consider that to be detransitioning? Because they've gone through all of the steps of social transition. They've potentially changed the name that people are associating with them, regardless on whether or not they've gotten that legally changed. They've changed their outward presentation and the pronouns that they want people to identify with them and all that stuff. If they change their mind at that point, do we still consider that to be detransitioning?
Yeah, so we have a big problem with terminology, right? And it is just such a big topic. I think it's just not going to be perfectly encapsulated in that term unless we decided to get all, academic with it and then just define it. But then that will then exclude a whole variety of experiences that we would then have to define elsewhere. From my perspective as a counselor, as soon as I start to see that those labels are actually getting in the way, that's where I can set them aside and just point out labels are templates. And when a template ceases to be useful for you, go ahead and throw it away, because we are so much more than the templates that are given to us. They're just guides. They're some guideposts, and you don't actually have to hit each of those guideposts on whatever your journey is. So I might reflect back what my client is using to describe their own situation, just as I would with reflecting back a client's name, pronouns, etc. I just find that to be a form of respect and a way of showing that I'm really listening. That if my client is saying that, oh yeah, I'm going through a detransitioning process, it's like, okay, tell me what that means for you. Mm-hmm. So that way I don't necessarily work with whatever picture I have in my head and superimpose that over on what they are experiencing. Because people who don't have to deal with the hoops of transitioning, whether that's legal, medical, social, etc., still have to go on their own journeys of self-discovery and just figuring out, oh, I am this, but I am not that. That's kind of a classic exercise, is to pick some identity and list out this kind of almost like a manifesto of things like, I don't know, the stereotypes of me being Asian, for instance. Like people listening to the podcast don't, surprise, I'm Asian. You can't see me, but yeah, that's last name Din, Vietnamese. But it's like, I am Asian, but I am not a biology major. That's like the stereotype. I'm Asian, and I was a dance major, actually. So way long ago. And so that addresses the stereotypes, but then also it's like, oh, I get to refine what that means. So if someone's detransitioning, it's like, okay, so where's your journey taking you next? And does that feel like you're undoing something? That's what I would suspect, is that someone who might be using that term for themselves might feel a sense of undoing. And that's what I would really want to pay attention to. It's like, oh, what is creating this need to undo whatever has happened? Or is there a sense of retreat, or is there just a sense of new, right? Maybe the person doesn't have the words for it. So it's like, okay, so drop that, even make up a new word if you really want. And what will bring you satisfaction or peace, authenticity? Because there are so many things that have really changed over time, of how we define masculinity, of how we define femininity. What's going to resonate with you? Mm-hmm. And go ahead and transition to that. If that means a detransition or a retransition, or just simply being awesome, right?
Yeah.
My concern would then be if they have that sense of undoing. Are we talking about trauma? Are we talking about layers of trauma that have pushed people in one direction? Because on a more fundamental level, when reacting to trauma, to strong emotions, we very often go to extreme measures. We jump into kind of this black and white thinking that it has to be all or nothing, this or that. And because that's a survival tactic, it's hard to be nuanced when you just want to survive. Mm-hmm. And so if we can get a person back into a sense of safety and trust in themselves and in their environment, the nuance can come back. And that's really important.
I can definitely understand that. And I can also see how that can fit into a narrative that I've been presented before, but I personally have not known anybody who has experienced it, but I've had it presented to me as essentially as an argument against transition, being the AFAB individual who went through traumatic experiences, usually of a sexual nature, who transitions entirely because of those experiences, and then realizes that they did it for, quote, the wrong reasons, and detransitions from that because they realized that, or that they, and this one I've heard from a more firsthand, from like watching particular YouTubers who have detransitioned and who talk about their experience. But the AFAB individual who transitions because they so greatly dislike the stresses and the sexism that come with being assigned female at birth, and feel that transitioning will, quote, free them from that, and then they get a certain point of the way through transitioning and realize that they are unhappy with their decision and then detransition. I have had these presented to me by people who will remain nameless as an argument for me not to transition, but I do feel that that does fit into kind of the scenario that you were presenting of like if we're talking about somebody who is transitioning due to trauma and they get to a certain point in their transition and realize that this is not what they needed, could it be that the process of transitioning and seeing things through a different perspective and distancing themselves physically and emotionally and mentally from the place that they were when they were experiencing the trauma, even temporarily, put them in a space where they felt safe enough to be able to reevaluate their lives and that what will make them truly happy?
Yeah, I think it can definitely provide that opportunity. I'm not going to say that it will provide that opportunity. Yeah. It's not something that I would, I don't know, prescribe.
Transitioning is not a magic pill.
No, absolutely not. And that's the other thing that I think a lot of people mistake about transitioning and deciding to transition is the idea that like, if I do A, B, and C, then that will cure me of ever feeling sad again, or ever feeling insecure again, or that will just make me love my body. It's like that. Like there are plenty of other reasons to be really insecure or just downright hate your own body than gender.
Oh yeah, and there are, and just speaking from the experience of being trans, it's one of those things that it's not, transitioning does not cure depression, because you can be depressed for so many reasons. And so it's one of those things of like, there, again, I have heard the narrative of some people who have thought that if they transitioned to, quote, cure their dysphoria, that will cure their depression in general. But the reality is depression is a lot more nuanced than that, comes from a lot of different places, and the best thing to do with it is to go to therapy. Hashtag my own opinion. But it is one of those things. It's you still have to get to a point where you love yourself as an individual and as a person. And transitioning can just lighten the burden of that process, because you're handling this tiny little piece of the entirety that is you. And it just helps lighten things a little bit. But if you still like hate yourself for other reasons, then you need to work on those things as well. Because it's like me getting top surgery did not fix the fact that I'm still a chunky boy and want to lose weight. I still have to do that step. Like, it's not a magic pill. But that is part of the narrative that I've seen from listening to the stories of people who have medically transitioned and then medically detransitioned. Most of the narratives that I have seen, I will give the caveat that most of the ones that I have watched have been AFAB individuals who started on hormones, did not get to a point where they decided to get any surgeries done, but got a certain, within like a year or two of being on testosterone, and decided that it wasn't right for them and stopped taking testosterone. And testosterone's a hell of a drug, and there's certain things that never go back. And so they, in a lot of those videos where they're talking about their experiences, their voices are still deep, and they're still, even though they've been off of testosterone for like over a year, and they have to just kind of accept that, like, this, they have to go through a whole new process of learning to love themselves with their bodies and their voices as they are now. And but that it is one of those things that I have seen as a very common thread for that particular scenario, is thinking that if I get on testosterone, that will fix all my issues. If I transition, this will fix all my issues. But they don't sit down to actually look at what their issues are.
Yeah. I have to keep reminding myself to actually say something and not just nod on the podcast. So incredibly important. And that's where I feel like it can be really helpful to have a therapist that can help you along with that journey. Because identity and self-acceptance is so complicated. So often people just say, oh, you just need to be happy with yourself, right? And I don't know, it's kind of funny to talk about self-acceptance through transition, because I know that's what boggles the mind for a lot of people, is that like, wait, wouldn't self-acceptance mean that you just be okay with your body, etc.? But I guess so much of it depends on what you consider to be an essential and fundamental part of who you are, and in what way do you relate to those aspects.
Oh, yeah.
That very often it's not the body part itself, it's what that means to you. Like one of the counterpoints I usually give when someone says that, like, like the way that your body looks shouldn't matter to you. You should just accept who you are. I might bring up like, oh, okay, so let's bring up an imperfect parallel. So of course you can pick apart imperfect parallels. But this one is someone winds up doing a mastectomy because of breast cancer. It's like, okay, would you tell that person that, oh, it like absolutely doesn't matter, you should just be proud of your body as it is, and what's wrong with you if you go for a prosthetic? And it's like, no, you probably could, like most people would probably say you're coming off as a jerk in that situation. Yeah. Where it's like, oh, yes, be happy with that you are you. It doesn't make you any less of a person. And at the same time, that might be really important for that person to use a prosthetic or not, right? If the person chooses it, it would be kind of rude to say, what's wrong with you? Why are you using that? Because it's important.
Yeah. And a lot of that does come down to individual experience. Again, to use another imperfect parallel, if somebody has a different body part amputated, like if you have to have like your leg amputated, depending on a combination of when in your life that happened, what the people around you did in reaction to that, what you experience on a day-to-day post-amputation, and just your general natural levels of self-love and acceptance all pile on together to create, are you the type of person like that one stand-up comedian who a lot of his set has to do with the fact that, like, I only have one leg. I'm going to, like, make punch-up jokes about myself because I am comfortable enough to do that and I am not self-conscious about it? Or are you the type of person that finds it very important to have a very realistic prosthetic that you cover up with like pants and shoes and stuff like that, and you don't want people to know that you had your leg amputated? And then there's of course a spectrum of people in between, that you can't tell everybody who had to have a leg amputated and point to the guy that does stand-up comedy and be like, you should be like that guy, because not everybody's life experience is going to be the same as him.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just also shows it's not about the body part. It's what the body part means to them. And I think sometimes people don't realize that that's often a major criteria for medical professionals when they either do the evaluation themselves or ask someone to evaluate a client, of just what's the client or patient's expectation of what they will experience, of what they will gain or lose from performing whatever medical procedure, hormones, surgeries, etc. And that's not something that's unique to trans people. I know that's well, I'm told good plastic surgeons in general will be asking about that. So even if it's something that is purely just for aesthetic reasons, cool. All right. So this is what you are expecting, versus what will this mean? Like on a deeper everyday level for that person? In what ways will that change their functioning?
I feel that kind of also dips into the topic of medical gatekeeping, which I feel detransitioning and medical gatekeeping kind of are topics that go hand in hand, because another common theme that I've seen from watching people's stories on it is that they felt that the therapist who provided the letter for them to get their hormones did not take the time to fully evaluate them. I remember one in particular, the person was saying that they had maybe one or two visits with that particular therapist, and the therapist, it essentially came down to, do you want to transition? Yes. Do you want hormones? Yes. Here's your letter. And that was it. And I know that there are a number of trans people who wish for less gatekeeping, that they're like, why should I need a letter to begin with? It's my body. I can do with it what I want. But those stories are the exact reason why we have those steps in place, and why you are supposed to have a letter, and why in some insurance policies that are based on the older WPATH, they still want you to live socially transition for 1 year prior to starting hormones, is exactly for the reason of having people who start transitioning, get to a certain point into it, say, oops, this was not what I needed, actually. And then get on social media and say, and like decry trans people in general. This is, of course, with the little asterisks of the people who do this are a very, 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 very small percentage of trans people in general. Which is an important thing to point out. Because from my experience, the people who will try to use detransitioning as an argument for somebody to not transition don't actually look at the statistics of the number of people who medically detransition.
Which is kind of inherently difficult to study. So, of course, as with any study, make certain that you take that with a grain of salt. I still believe it's this tiny percentage. And even the tiny percentage, we need to rehumanize that percentage. And remember, those are still human beings deserving of compassion and understanding.
Absolutely. And I still, at some point, if able, I would love to have somebody who has experienced either social or medical detransitioning to be able to come on the show and tell their story, because I do feel like having that perspective is very important. You can also see these people's stories all over YouTube if you just search detransition, because, and of course, you're not going to get everybody's stories. You're going to get the stories of the people who had an experience that impacted them enough that they felt like they needed to share it with the world. And this is true both of trans people who did not detransition, as well as people who did detransition. And everybody who tells their story publicly tells it because they feel that it's important for others to hear their experience, either as something hopeful, something educational, or as a warning. So when you watch those, you have to understand that there's a reason they put this on the internet. Try to look past the emotional aspects of what they're saying. Understand them and absorb them, and understand that this person did have an experience that did have an emotional impact on their lives. But also look at what is their motivation for sharing this. Are they doing this just to educate, hey, I had this experience, this is something that does happen, and it is a valid experience? Or are they sharing it as a decry against transitioning in general, and trying to use their personal experience as a story to be blanketed over an entire community of people?
Yeah, is it something that's truly generalizable?
Yeah.
Versus anecdotal?
Yeah. Which any trans person sharing their experience should always be taken as anecdotal, because no two individual people in the world have the exact same life experience in general. There's a lot of common threads that you can find. There's a lot of common threads you can make if you look hard enough, that may or may not actually be there, which a lot of people like to do. It is entirely anecdotal, which is why a lot of the times when you see even on medical professionals' websites, you do see, usually on the good ones that I've read through, you will see them have that disclaimer of no two people's experience will be the same. If you look at these before and after pictures, your body will not look exactly like this other person's body. Your mileage may vary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even kind of to like step back from the medical aspect of it, because we've delved very deep into the medical transition, the medical detransition. But there's also the people who have started the social transition, and then decide during the social transition that without any hormones or anything like that, that they want to change course. With that, I mean, with both of them, there's a lot of stigma around detransitioning. And especially within the trans community. I mean, you're going to get it from cis people as well, but within the trans community, we still have this stigma against people who detransition and from what I've seen, it's almost this sense of betrayal of like, oh, you joined us and then you decided that you didn't want to be a part of us anymore, type of thing. Like we've kind of created this very tribe mentality behind it, which makes it very difficult for people to feel that they can detransition. And I feel that that also kind of fuels the people who end up having a rhetoric of trans people are mean when they do detransition, and trans people are bad because they had that negative experience when they realized that they needed to detransition for whatever reason, and then ran into people within the community that they were at one point welcomed in with open arms, and then were not given that same support when they had to make another difficult life decision in a direction that was not considered to be, like, big quotes, the right, like, the good decision. Like, you've gone back to the enemy. But that also gets into the whole, like, trans people who hate cis people thing, which is a whole nother can of worms that we're not going to delve into, because that's a whole episode in and of itself.
But yeah, that internal gatekeeping that happens. It's tough, again, from that place of vulnerability. It makes sense that people who have been oppressed and marginalized will find it really important to protect a sense of we, us, of a community. And anything that potentially threatens that, is a threat, is a major threat. That you don't have the rest of society to fall back on. That's that sense of, here's the P word, privilege. So coming from a place of marginalization, betrayal is that much more highlighted. Or anything that feels like betrayal, especially if it challenges your own sense of self. That if you're for yourself, there is no option to detransition. This is absolutely who you are. Seeing someone else do that can feel like a threat to your own experience, and that's a natural shortcut that our brains make. Is we try on what other people's experiences are, and if we reject that, we try to reject it for everyone. And that goes well past political boundaries. That just happens to us all. And leads to those things of that can be the transphobia. That can be that there's plenty of that with homophobia. We can look through history of that, of just like, oh, this, that doesn't make sense to me. So none of you can get married.
Yeah.
That way. So yeah, someone who seems to be part of this particular picture of transness, that says nope, can be perceived as a threat to anyone that does fit that, when that's a false connection. It's not something that's actually that's actually true. Although some people will use it as a weapon. So that reinforces it, that we're able to point out to this one person, like, oh, hey, see, you can do that too. It's like, not really. That's their journey.
Yeah.
But it also makes it difficult for people who are considering entering and exploring that. So they live in that liminal space between being certain that they're part of the trans community and not. We wind up reinforcing that with, oh, what's that term? Trans trender.
Yes.
Yes. That's someone, it's as though it's like, oh, you have to be certain in order to be part of this community, as opposed to, it's like, well, here, it was a tough journey for me. Let's just open up the door just a little bit more for you, so that way you can drift in, see what this is. If this is home for you, awesome. But if it's not, kudos to you. You are off on your own gender journey. Enjoy that. Enjoy that, where maybe you're not a trans woman, maybe you're an effeminate boy, and that is awesome that you get to be that.
Or a term that I've seen on Tumblr a couple of times. Haven't run into it in the wild yet, but a term that I've seen on Tumblr, which is the Hehim Lesbians.
You heard of that one?
It's an interesting category, because, to my understanding, which could be wrong, and anybody listening, feel free to correct me, but my understanding of it is that it is someone who's AFAB, who does not feel like they are a man, does not identify with being a man, but identifies with a certain extent of masculinity, to where they are, they present very butch, and they refer to themselves with he, him pronouns, but do not have any physical dysphoria, and have no intention of doing any medical transitioning, or doing more than just, like, the most social transitioning that they feel that they want to do is using he him pronouns. That's my understanding of it from the context that I've seen the term used. Again, I have not encountered he him lesbian in the wild. I have not been able to ask their personal experience or how they feel about that and what led them to identify as this. I feel it would be a very interesting story to hear. But that falls under the whole, to my brain's way of rationalizing it is sliding it into the nebula of non-binary, even though I acknowledge that people who do identify as that may not call themselves non-binary, and that's very 100% valid because you can only identify yourself. But that's my brain's way of being able to wrap itself around that concept. It's closer to the non-binary nebula than not. But to outside of that, they 100% identify as a cis woman who's a lesbian. They just prefer masculine pronouns.
Yeah. One I haven't encountered in the wild either. Kudos to those that do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to attempt to delegitimize somebody else's identity.
Yeah. And yeah, that I think it's just, again, different people have their different journeys.
Yeah.
And different ways of describing those journeys. So, like, there's a period that, yeah, I was able to function and be pretty happy with who I was by just describing myself as an effeminate male. It's just like, oh, okay, yeah. Sure, I don't feel like I need to do all the big drastic changes that I thought was required for being trans. It's like, okay, so I can work with what I have here. Not all of these different social norms, etc., which I got to really embrace by jumping into the gay community. Not realizing that I was really looking at like the gay community that was really playing around with gender. And I feel like half the people there wound up coming out as trans later anyway. But do we look at that journey and say I detransitioned from effeminate boy?
I mean, I think a lot of that is very, I'm just going to say nebulous because it's lots of hand gestures happening for those who can't see anything.
Yes.
Which was a mistake because now my pectoral muscles hurt. Yay, recovery time. But that's also like what, again, like where in the universe of gender do you personally place effeminate boy? Do you place that closer to female or do you place that closer to male? If you place that closer to male and were assigned male at birth, would switching to non-binary be detransitioning, or would that be transitioning forward? Like, where do you place everything on the map? And that's a very individualized thing. But that's also one of the things of like when we do kind of societal gatekeeping for even social transitioning, we're limiting people's ability to explore gender because sometimes we don't start off having the words for it. Or sometimes we feel, to use a conversation that I had with a friend of mine a while back, the deeper you look into gender, the more you realize that gender is a construct, and you reach a certain point where you kind of become post-gender, to where the only reason why you're continuing to use any gendered identity is entirely for social construct reasons and because it's easier for other people to understand. Whereas your understanding of your own gender identity is so much more nuanced based on your personal journey and your understanding of what gender actually is that it becomes harder and harder for you internally to define yourself. And so it just becomes easier to say, like, to identify with whatever you're closest to.
Yeah. And at the same time, what I've started to point out to people is when something is a social construct, that doesn't mean that you get to change what it is arbitrarily. It's just the way that we describe it and categorize it is constructed. The thing itself is there. That is that it's this very intuitive aspect and sense of self on a deep level. The way we describe that is constructed, not that feeling.
Oh yeah, and it's like when, again, to use my own journey as an anecdotal example, 100% anecdotal. When I first started exploring gender, I was in college and I had friends who, very shortly after me meeting them, came out as trans. It was very consistent. Like, I would meet these people, and then in under a year, they would be like, "Oh, I'm trans," or like within a couple of years. I think I had maybe a couple of friends that didn't start actually identifying outwardly as trans until like after we all got out of college. I would look at their journeys and look at their experiences and say, well, I'm not trans enough. And at the time, this was in like 2008-ish, I didn't have access to terminology like non-binary, gender fluid, and stuff like that. So I remember having a conversation with one of my friends and saying, like, I don't particularly enjoy having these female anatomical parts, but I would be okay with strapping them on for going outside to the grocery store when I need to present as female. So if I could just come home at the end of the day and take my boobs off, I would be happy. And I didn't have a word for it, but I knew that at that time, I felt like because I didn't have the same experience as the very, very few trans men in my life at the time, with very, very limited resources and research that I could do in 2008. It's amazing how far we've come in like a little over a decade. I felt like I could not identify myself as a trans man. And then a few years later found the word gender fluid and said, okay, well, that pretty accurately describes, this earlier scenario conversation that I had had. So I am going to adopt this term until I have a better term for it. And I identified as that for close to a decade. But even when I was identifying as gender fluid, I still very much had in my mind, like, I want to have top surgery at some point. And I feel like that did not delegitimize my identity at that time. Currently, I identify as a trans man because I am closest to that in the universe that is gender. To get more nuanced, I would say I'm realistically a gender non-conforming trans man, because once I could still see myself putting on a pair of sexy heels and strutting down a catwalk and doing things that are not generally considered to be masculine, which is something I've seen other trans men do. And you know at least one of them that I'm talking about.
And I love it. But go
on. But just this entire idea of like, okay, I've gotten my physicality to a certain point where I am comfortable with that aspect of my outward appearance of my gender. I do not get misgendered anymore. I am identified on the street the way that I would like to be. Now we're going to play around with that. Now that I'm comfortable with this, we're going to play around with the gender norms and the gender conforming aspects of it. And again, it's more of like a post-gender mentality of like, you know, I am more than just this tiny box of male. Like I do feel like I fit in this box, but I feel like I am more than that. But yeah, and
I feel like I'm supposed to say something. All I can think of is just cool.
I'm trying to remember the initial point that I went on that anecdote about, but it kind of comes down to that, like you need to be able to have the freedom to play with gender and to continue playing with gender, because transitioning is not point A to point B. Your transition does not necessarily have to end, like, because we are constantly changing and growing over the entire course of our lives, and we learn more things about ourselves, and society changes over time, and all of these other things. And
maybe it might help to keep in mind that cisgender people have a gender journey.
Yes.
That their experience and relationship to their own sense of self, including their gender and their sex, is something that changes over time, is complex and is confusing, and doesn't always match societal norms. And so doing all of the steps that you may have outlined for yourself to transition to whatever gender identity, whatever label you give, you're like, it's still going to be a human experience that, you're going to relate to it differently over time. And that is fine. Hopefully the steps that you have taken, medical, social, legal, etc., give you tools that help you along in that journey.
And a lot of it just the goal, very loosely using the word goal, the goal should always be contentment with your own existence. And what that looks like for each individual person is going to vary wildly. There are certain people that do very much have that, like, what's considered to be the stereotypical cookie cutter trans experience, where it's like, you know, as soon as I understood the concept of gender or was self-aware enough to be able to understand what I was looking at in the mirror, I knew something was wrong. You know, went through all these steps, went through getting hormones and this procedure and that procedure and the other procedure, and reached this point that I considered myself to have transitioned enough, and that's it. I am content at this point. I do not feel the need to do anything else. And then you have other people who feel that, get to a certain point, feel that contentment for a while, and then are just introduced to a new concept, like men in dresses, and go, oh, well, if they can do that, maybe I can do that too. But it is also one of those things where you have the experience for AFAB transmasculine individuals versus AMAB transfeminine individuals is also wildly different, because and it's entirely on a societal aspect of it, where, you know, within the trans community, we do try to uplift people and be like, you know, you do what makes you happy. But anecdotally speaking, I've had conversations with several different trans feminine individuals who the societal pressure to perform a certain level of femininity, specifically being somebody who's AMAB, prevents them from being able to feel comfortable enough to veer away from that tiny little box of what society has deemed to be feminine. Whereas with AFAB transmasculine individuals, there's a lot more room to play, I feel, just from what I've seen. Like, there is a certain amount of privilege that trans men have as opposed to trans women.
Yeah. Or permission to kind of explore and play around with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because and even with even cis women experience this, where you're quote unquote allowed to walk around in a tuxedo and still be identified female if you fit within this particular box of what female looks like. Whereas if you are presenting as like butch female, even cis women get misgendered as male. And that's because we have a more narrow definition of femininity than we have for masculinity.
Mm-hmm. And some part of me,
it's like gender is a societal construct, and gender is very much enforced by society. So when you decide to go against that construct, you bring with it whatever particular risks go along with going against what society is enforcing and how society is enforcing it, which varies from region to region, even from neighborhood to neighborhood. Because like if you're a trans feminine individual in a tuxedo presenting as butch and you're in the neighborhood, it's going to gender is enforced very differently there than in like a super red area.
Yeah. Having the permission I did growing up to be as effeminate as I was growing up, in many ways actually delayed me figuring out that I'm trans, I'm certain. Because, I just, even with my parents raising me, getting to be able to dance, to be more creative, to explore my artistic side, to coming out as bi way back then, and getting to be with gay men who a bunch of them being drag queens and just playing around with gender, etc. I just got to explore that and just be. And I am certain that if I had grown up in an environment where I wasn't allowed to do that, I may very much have kind of tried to leapfrog over the gender non-conforming period of my life, really. And that may have needed some fine-tuning later, I imagine. I'm just like picturing some alternate universe version of me that grew up in a bit more of an oppressive environment and said, you know what, I need to transition and do all this, and then say like, whoa,
yeah,
back up. There's, I'm okay with some of these aspects here, not okay with that. It would have been a much more complicated journey, I think.
Mm-hmm. I can totally understand that.
Now, I apologize if you're hearing a dog here in the background.
Thank you for coming on the show again.
As always, fantastic to be on your show. Thank you for having me.
Like this episode? Tell someone about it. Have any questions or concerns? Please feel free to send an email to transfieldguide@gmail.com. Also be sure to subscribe to keep up with the latest episodes. Stay safe, and remember, I'm proud of you.